And then in 1913, in a really interesting gambit, the Illinois legislature, by a simple majority vote, gave women the right to vote in elections not created by the state of Illinois. Okay? So, women couldn't vote for Illinois legislators or governor, but they could vote for Congress, and they could vote for township elections. Now, this does represent a kind of chutzpah, it seems to me. On the other hand, they tried and tried to get women the right to vote by the standard route. This worked. And several other states are going to adopt this Illinois approach. So not only is Illinois east of the Mississippi, but they're approaching this a new way. And I want to use Illinois also as an example of something that is happening throughout the North, to a lesser extent in the South, much lesser extent in the South. First of all, women are forming clubs, all kinds of clubs. Prohibition of alcohol clubs, cycling clubs, and women's clubs. And those clubs tended to interest themselves in social issues, like kindergartens. Wanted kindergartens. Wanted to outlaw alcohol. That meant that these women increasingly became aware that they couldn't vote. It would be really handy to further these issues if they could vote. So in Chicago, for example, the Chicago Women's Club in 1894 split off and formed the Chicago Political Equality League, which was a women's suffrage group. It wasn't associated with either the National or the American initially, and they are working for women's suffrage in Illinois. In 1903, Jane Addams, who was the head of Hull House, if that means anything to you, formed a branch of the Women's Trade Union League in Illinois. And what that means is that instead of this being just a working class women's movement, you are trying to bring in working women and immigrant women. And thirdly, in 1913, you have the founding of the Alpha Club in Chicago, I have this backwards, by Ida Barnett Wells. Ida B. Wells, the Alpha Club, was the black women's suffrage movement. And Ida B. Wells is very typical of the kind of women that, black women, that tended to be involved in the suffrage movement. She had founded one of the leading newspapers in the South, and she started and ran the anti-lynching movement in the United States. If women could vote, that would be very helpful. So black women, like the Women's Club women, came with agendas that were specific to black women, and it is further complicated by the fact that often black women had to lobby not just for the right of black women to vote, but for the right of black men to vote. And so sometimes they're a little out of sync with the regular suffrage movement because of that need to take care of black men as well as black women. So there is movement out there, but it is not coming from any kind of organized national direction. And then, well, I should say in 1900, the national American Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association united. But with a brief spell when Carrie Chapman Catt was in charge, their leadership was quite weak initially. And I'm now just going to refer to that as NASA because it's easier to say. Things began to change. In 1910, Alice Paul, who had been in England and working with the women's suffrage movement in England, returned to the United States. And she had been arrested, jailed, force-fed in England. She came back in part to recoup her health, and she went to the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1911 and said, "Let me take over your congressional campaign." The congressional campaign was the campaign for passing the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, which is what will be the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. There had been a lobbying effort, supposedly. They had a budget of $10 a year, and it was headed by the wife of a congressman who would occasionally, a couple of times a year, have some congressmen in for tea and suggest to them that passing the Anthony Amendment would be a good idea, and that's about as far as it went. Alice Paul was told she could take it over, but she'd have to raise her own money. Alice Paul arrived in Washington, she got an office, and she started a lobbying effort that would be sophisticated by modern standards. I'm just going to give you one example. But she had a card file on every congressman. And every 2 years, they redid that card file. Okay? And one of the things that was on the card for the congressman was what time they came to work. Did they come early? Did they stay late? And if they came early, there was a woman in their hallway early, hopefully from their own state, if one was there, present in D.C., who would walk down the hall with them and explain why they should vote for women's suffrage. And if they stayed late, there was a woman in that hallway late to walk down with them. This was, as I say, just an extraordinary sophisticated operation. But the other thing that Alice Paul was a genius at was publicity. And this is the beginning of an era where publicity really matters. Woodrow Wilson was elected President of the United States in 1912, and Alice Paul immediately got busy. She did pull this off in about 6 weeks, organizing a parade the day before his inauguration down Pennsylvania Avenue. There's never been anything like it. There've been women's parades in New York, but this kind of massive parade around an inauguration was something entirely new. The DC police said they were too busy with the inauguration to provide any security, but they forged ahead. This is a picture of the crowd. Now, if you look at that crowd very carefully, and I know it's hard to